Thank you very, very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here. Despite whatever else has been said, I'm Darrel, and I put on a pair of blue jeans, and I love to drive my brother's International Harvester 5488 tractor out on the prairies of North Dakota. So I haven't left that behind. The 500th anniversary of the Reformation will occur in about a year. And one of the things that a Reformation does is provide an occasion for people to assess its legacy. What continues to be important today? So over the next 12 months, there will be a lot of people coming from a lot of different perspectives trying to answer that question for themselves. Today, I want to focus on one small piece of that legacy. What I intend to do is this. First, I will try to speak about some features about Luther, and then I'll try to speak about some features of our society, and then I'll try to bring them together. So some about Luther, some about our society, and some about trying to bring them together. Now, this really flies in the face, perhaps, of any kind of wisdom for a Sunday night for clergy who have been at work all day in one way or another. But I'm going to try to ask you to work with me tonight. This is putting together some things that I haven't put together in quite the same way before. And so I'm not sure that I've got the best way to organize it or the clearest way to say it. And so I'm going to ask you to think along with me and then make some comments and some helpful suggestions or raise helpful questions in the end. I'm going to try to make the outline clear as I go along, and then I'll kind of wander around between the different parts of the outline. So let me begin with part one, which has to do with Luther, and begin by just simply noting that he was a very complex person. When it came to the gospel, he was bold and courageous and rather stubborn, combative as well. This came from a variety of things, in part from his personality, in part because he felt that he didn't get the kind of reaction from the church authorities and his fellow theologians that he wanted, in part because he had a deep sense of his own calling to be a teacher of the church. And then later in life, when he struggled with church leadership and with his own health issues, he became quite irascible. But this is not the only Luther. He could also be a tender-hearted father. He could also be a generous friend. He could also be a self-doubting reformer, a sensitive, compassionate, and encouraging pastoral counselor, and an advocate for social reform. What I want to do today is to pick up one aspect of this Luther while fully recognizing that it's only one aspect, and there are many, many other parts of Luther that we could be talking about. I think to do just one other introductory comment about this, I think it helps to hold the various pieces of Luther together if we talk just a minute about the framework within which he worked. For him, what God was up to was reconciliation. God was in Christ, of course, reconciling all people to himself, and only God, as Luther would insist, could do this God-human reconciling. Because of sin, we are powerless to make it happen. But God's project is much larger than bringing people to faith. God's project is the reconciliation of everyone and everything in the world. To borrow a phrase, God is about mending the world. Healing the God-human relationship is an important but only one part of that mending. As is evident from the images of shalom in the Bible, the image, for example, of spears being beaten into plowshares swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, the image of a wolf lying down with a lamb, the image of going the second mile, turning the other cheek, the image of a city in which the gates are open and there's water and food and medicine and access to God readily available for all. Whether you deal with any of these images, God's project is to foster whole, healthy relationships all around, between humans and the world, among humans, between humans and God. God is making all things new. On Luther's view, of course, God does this by working behind the scenes, working in and through humans, in and through creatures. So our calling, our vocation, is to be agents of that reconciliation. And I should add, this is also the calling of the church. If churchgoers do not see this, everything gets distorted into cheap grace and pseudo-gospels having to do either with individual comfort or with a sense of entitlement. So long as any group is being devalued, so long as any group of people is being excluded, so long as the earth is being damaged, and so long as we behave as if our fate is not connected to the fate of everything else in this world, reconciliation has not yet been achieved. Having sketched this larger framework, let us turn to a dimension of Luther's thought that doesn't get as much attention as his own religious problems and the theology that grows out of that. And this dimension is the role of reconciliation in the public sphere. We should remind ourselves that Luther was involved in virtually every public issue of his day. We could do a much longer list, but just to name off a few: starting schools for young men and young women, arguing against having a crusade, trying to find ways to deal with the beggars in society, changing the rules of who could marry in society, opposing high interest rates, reforming the university. The list could go on and on and on. He was involved in virtually every issue of his day. Though this involvement took different forms, let me focus on two examples. Number one, the example of what he did in the last days of his life. He arbitrated and negotiated a dispute between Count Albrecht III and the mine workers of Mansfeld. Mine workers who, in von Lohenwick's words, complained about oppression and exploitation because of the Count's avarice, unquote. This Count, by the way, didn't get along with his relatives any better than he did with the miners. 3 times before, Luther had tried to mediate, even traveling in 1545 over to Mansfeld, but none of them had been successful until 1546, when he spent 3 weeks, managed to negotiate an agreement, and then died the next day. This arbitration is one example, but only one of different times in which he was called upon to settle disputes. Example number 2, when the princes of Swabia sent to several theologians the 12 articles that spelled out what it was that they wanted in order to get justice in their relationship to their landlords, Luther was the only theologian to respond. Though he objected to including the word Christian in their self-designated title of a Christian association, he considered most of what the peasants were seeking to be just. Addressing the princes, he urged negotiation rather than force. "If it is still possible," he wrote, "to give you advice, my lords, give way a little to the will and wrath of God. The proverb says, a cartload of hay must give way to a drunken man. How much more ought you to stop your raging and obstinate tyranny and not deal unreasonably with the peasants as though they were drunk or out of their minds? Do not start a fight for them, for you do not know how it will end. Try kindness first, for you do not know what God will do to prevent the spark that will kindle all of Germany and start a fire that no one can extinguish." he makes clear that he thinks both the peasants and the princes were in the wrong. The princes, quote, have done nothing but cheat and rob the people so that you, that is they, might lead a life of luxury and extravagance, unquote. And the peasants are wrongly trying to use violence to change the situation. Even though justice was on their side, they were mistaken in this use of violence. Near the end of the response, he says to both sides, take a hold of these matters properly with justice and not with force or violence, and do not start endless bloodshed in Germany, for because both of you are wrong, and both of you want to avenge and defend yourselves, both of you will destroy yourselves, and God will, as another proverb says, use one rascal to flog another. Of course, things did not turn out as Luther wanted. The princes did not negotiate. Instead, they did as Luther had worried. They waited around until rebellion broke out, and then they responded with a great show of force. And the peasants also did not negotiate. They took up the simple arms that they had and began to occupy castles and other property. What shines through Luther's main involvements, of which these are just two examples, is in his day was his appeal for negotiation, yes, but even more so, his concern for the common good. He was concerned about the effects of these things on all of Germany. He's worried about the common good, but also especially concerned about the effects of a present injustice on what it will do for the poor. In their recent book, Timothy Lull started a book he never finished, and Derek Nelson finished it. They comment on the last years of Luther's life. Luther's friends, quote, were consistently surprised that he rebuked those who disrespected common folk, unquote. To the end of his life, it was the common folk who deserved a break. Part two, some features of our society. One of the things that characterize our society, I think, is anxiety and fear. As distinguished from fear, anxiety is free-floating. Fear is focused. If I come walking through the woods and I encounter a bear, I'm going to experience fear. But once I'm convinced that the bear has wandered off the path and away from me, the fear will disappear. But when anxiety is present, it persists. And then it attaches itself to whatever occasion of fear comes along and exaggerates the fear that I'm experiencing. The two come together that way. It's hard to know what the sources are of the pervasive anxiety that are part of Americans. For example, we could speculate about one of them, what some of them might be. One, for example, is the lack of community support because we're so individualized. We're dependent on ourselves, and for many of us, only a severe illness or a downturn in the economy stands between us and economic ruin. Think of that in contrast to the family that I visited, members of the Old Order Amish in Pennsylvania. The woman in the family was about 30 years old, 5 children, all very young, elementary school age. Her husband had died at, I think, 28 from a very, very unusual disease. Everything she needed was provided by the community. Her house, the food, the clothing, schooling, everything. The kind of anxiety I'm talking about is living a style of life that most of us do in America, where we have nothing like that to count on, and that creates anxiety. Or maybe advertising has something to do with it, that advertising keeps reminding us of what we do not have and that we should have. Or the mushroom-shaped cloud still hangs over us. Or the news provides a steady stream of information about disasters, not because the media are at fault, but this is because what people want and read and look at. Our anxiety grows, And still another part of our anxiety may come from the confusion that many Americans feel because not everyone in the world genuflects before America's moral authority as they have come to expect should be the case. And the effects of pollution and climate change are increasingly evident. These are all possible sources of anxiety, but there may be others as well. Once internalized, they're very difficult to identify. But the combination of free-floating anxiety and specific fears tends to dominate our thinking. And when it dominates our thinking, we become distrustful. We identify enemies, boundaries become barriers, the world becomes divided into good guys and bad guys, our thinking becomes so either or that it's hard to think of alternatives, and all of this leads us to be susceptible to manipulation whenever any talk show host or politician comes along and appeals to those fears. So the first feature is fear and anxiety. The second feature of American society that I want to identify is polarization. This goes beyond differences of opinion and beyond contrasting recommendations of what we should do as a society. Polarization involves the perception that the alternative approach is dangerous and has to be resisted in every way. Compromise then becomes a bad word, and as the result is at worst conflict and at best paralysis. David Brooks, the somewhat conservative columnist for the New York Times, wrote an op-ed page on September 2nd in which he said two things that I want to mention. First, identity politics, and he means by identity politics separating into groups of citizens and immigrants, or groups of racial groups, or ethnic groups, or whatever way you want to divide up the American population. Identity politics, as practiced by Trump, he's not a very, he doesn't like Trump very much, but also by others on the left and the right, which is appropriate for us, distracts from the reality that we are one nation. It corrodes the sense of solidarity. It breeds suspicion, cynicism, and distrust. End of quotation. Second, what happens then is that, quote, politics is no longer about argument or discussion. It's about trying to put your opponents into the box of the untouchables, unquote. Into the box of the untouchables. That's polarization. I worry a lot about polarization because of historical precedents. In the late 1920s, the Weimar Republic produced gridlock in the German parliament. The government was unable to respond to the economic crises of the 20s or again of 1930. And the Nazis gained a following simply by claiming to be able to get things done and to get the people back together again. Their share of the vote shot up, and though they never achieved an absolute majority, they did get access to chancellor's seat, and with that they quickly undermined the substance of democracy and plunged the country in totalitarianism and war. I say this not to inspire fear, but to argue that polarization is not something to be ignored. We all need to take steps to correct it. Okay, two characteristics, fear and anxiety and polarization. They are not unrelated, because polarization has as one of its sources fear and anxiety. And then I want to then say that polarization also has some other sources. So fear and anxiety are one source of polarization. I want to name a second and a third source. The second source is ideology. And ideology is not just a set of ideas, but a set of ideas that are regarded to be the whole truth about the topic, and to issue in proposals that are only these proposals that are worth considering. Again, different opinions and different judgments are not necessarily different ideologies, but disagreements that completely discount the value of the alternative, that's an ideology. There are many practical steps that could be taken, for example, to ease our immigration problems, the problems of administering immigration I'm talking about. The former president of Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service said, one of the most significant sources of illegal aliens, as they're called in the United States, is people who come to the United States on a visitor's visa because they have an elderly parent that they need to take care of, who is a citizen. And when the visitor's visa runs out, they have a choice between either overstaying the visa or going back to their home country and not being able to come back for 6 years. Now, it seems to me that's something we could sit down and fix, right? But the minute the word immigration comes up, ideologies come up, alternative ideologies come up, polarization occurs, and the result is paralysis, and nothing happens. A lot needs to be done with roads and bridges in Minnesota. But the minute it comes up, ideological differences about how it should be funded yield nothing. Or take the problem of climate change, or gun violence, or the Zika virus, or access to abortion, or the size of the military budget, or just go on. In every case, ideologies contribute to polarization, and at least in some cases, to paralysis. 3, there's also, I'm not to part 3 yet, but the third source of polarization, and that's what I would call structural. I mean, the way a society is structured in terms of its economic and its racial inequality. Now, the dynamic here is different from what I've been talking about, because it seems to me that what's at work in that kind of structural source of polarization is blindness. Those who are doing well don't even see the poor. Or if they do see them, they blame them for their plight, blame the poor themselves for their plight, which is just another way of not seeing them. Those who benefit from white privilege don't see how different the day-to-day experience is of persons of color. For example, if I was, rolled the clock back a few years and I had teenage sons, if one of them would have done something that would have been out of order, the policeman would have brought them to my house, explain what happened, and say, well, there was a teenager acting out, and walk away and leave the family to take care of it. But my children went to an urban school in a town of 105,000 and an urban area of 500,000. And if one of their black or Hispanic friends had done exactly the same act, the police response would be entirely different in terms of arrest and probably some kind of harassment. The issue here is that even more important than the difference is the fact that most of us who are in the position that I'm in don't recognize that the difference exists. Because we don't even think about the fact that my experience of dealing with police is not normative. And that there are other people who have an entirely different experience from mine. And that's hard, therefore, to formulate a concept of the common good that can take account of those very significant differences of experience. We have to work hard at it together in order to do that. And a similar difference affects those who are poor, because poverty entails not just a lack of money, but a lack of access. The world looks different when every problem brings a person face to face with a roadblock. How does a person get a job without a car? How do you have a car without a job? How do you organize your life when your employer won't tell you until the night before what your hours are for the next day? How does a person solve a legal problem when you can't afford a lawyer? How do you access medical care when the only insurance you can afford has a really high deductible? And how do you encourage your children to stay in school when you had to drop out to work yourself and you have no experience to draw upon to help them get into high school and do well in high school and get into college and so on? Our social structure results in quite different experiences and understanding of the society in which we live, and this divides us and becomes one source of polarization. So what I've been saying is that anxiety and fear, allegiance to ideologies, and socially structured differences all contribute to polarization. And this polarization undermines our ability to face and deal with our problems. Before going on, let me add a footnote. It's possible that my description of society fits some parts of this synod more than others. I suspect that there are somewhat more coherence in small towns than in larger cities, but that doesn't exclude polarization, because polarization then simply exists between that neighborhood and some other neighborhood in the United States. I know from my trips back to the farm where I grew up and to the small town where I went to school, I know from that that coherence is far less than it once was in rural communities. The farmers used to work together in haying, in harvest, silo filling, and now they seldom talk with each other, not because they're on the outs or they're indifferent to each other, but they just live in independent lives. And when I hear them talk with each other, they say, "Boy, I haven't seen you for a long time," etc. The community used to gather on Saturday nights. The stores were open, and people spent as much time on the street visiting as they did in the stores buying their groceries and their work gloves and their tools. Now this tradition is remembered one Saturday night in July, old-fashioned Saturday night, and nothing has replaced it for the rest of the year. As a result, the community ties are considerably looser. What has been lost, Robert Putnam says, is the social capital that a community needs in order to deal with its crises and its problems. This social capital, he says, comes from frequent face-to-face encounters that build trust, and trust is the essence of that social capital. As he has documented in several ways, it's been on decline for the last 50 years. Part 3, making some connections. What then might the legacy of Luther and the Reformation have to offer to this society if I've described it accurately? Allow me to consider the 3 causes of polarization in the opposite order, starting with structural, which was the last one I talked about. Divisions that arise because one group of people has an entirely different experience from another group of people. Let me say 2 things about this. First, one of the ELCA colleges recently gave an honorary degree to an overseas student who had spent some time at that college, gone back to his home country, and made significant contributions to that society. In his response, as he received the degree, he expressed his appreciation to that college because he said while he was there for the first time in his life, he was seen, S-E-E-N, seen. Not seen as a member of a social class, not seen as a member of a family, but seen as an individual with his own intrinsic worth. I want to borrow that image, and I want to suggest that the gospel, as Luther understood it, is about being seen. Loving one's neighbor is about seeing one's neighbor. Luther's own experience with the church authorities was telling him to keep quiet, was all about not being seen. The peasants in Luther's day were suffering very difficult changes from a barter economy to a money economy, and the peasants' revolt that broke out was essentially in response to not having been seen for what was happening in their lives. And Luther's theology says that unless we see God through the eyes of the suffering, we do not see the God who is incarnate in Jesus. And unless we see ourselves and our neighbors through the eyes of suffering, we also do not understand those around us. The fact is that we as a society have too often not seen the poor, not seen persons of color, not seen those displaced by economic changes or those suffering from sexual abuse and many others. In a society that does everything it possibly can to ignore and camouflage suffering, and everything that it possibly can to ignore or camouflage race or ethnicity, it's sometimes startling to read what Luther has to say about suffering. Suffering, suffering, cross, cross. This and nothing else is the Christian law. The very fact that Luther responded to the peasants and affirmed the justice of their concerns was a way of seeing them. Yes, he disagreed with them about how they named themselves, but he did not dismiss them. He took up their concerns seriously enough to comment on them and to urge the princes to negotiate and to warn the princes that they would be knocked off their pedestals, either if they did not respond to the peasants, either by them, and if not by them, by somebody else that God would raise up. Reconciliation requires a mutual seeing, a mutual understanding. To the degree that the polarization is structural and social, not individual, those in more privileged groups need not only to see their neighbors and their suffering, but also to see their own privilege and to see the structural injustice that isolates and polarizes. So a crucial part of our calling as church leaders is to help ourselves and others recognize that privilege and recognize the accompanying injustice. For that recognition is a first step which needs to be taken before people can take the next steps, which is to come together to talk, to find common ground, and to figure out some things that we can do about these problems. A few years ago, Sharon Parks and 3 of her colleagues examined 100 people from around the country who were deeply engaged in their communities, people of very different backgrounds from different parts of the country, and they looked for common themes and common experiences. And some of what they found they expected. They expected that they'd had examples to follow. They'd expected, as they did, they expected they had mentors who raised the right questions and gave the right encouragement, and they had that. But they discovered one theme or commonness in their experience that they had not anticipated. They called it a constructive, enlarging engagement with the other. Virtually every one of the 100 had had an experience or a series of experiences where they came to recognize the humanity of somebody on the other side of a social boundary. Usually it involves sensing their humanity through sensing their suffering. Note that the operative word here is engagement, because merely being exposed to somebody on the other side of a social boundary doesn't help and sometimes makes things worse. Engagement, a constructive, enlarging engagement with the other. To use my terminology, the constructive, enlarging engagement with the other enabled these 100 persons to see the humanity of someone they had not before seen. And this led them to develop a significant response. What Parks is describing sometimes happens to a college student, for example, who goes to study overseas. And they come back impressed by the poverty and the suffering that they've seen, but also equally impressed by the dignity of the people they met who are dealing with that suffering and the poverty. The question for us clergy is, how do we create those kinds of experience for others with whom we come into contact? And then, how do we organize the follow-up where that experience can be used constructively to overcome the polarization and the separations of our society? So this is my first comment when it comes to the structural causes of polarization. My second comment is to go back to Martin Luther and to find an example in his life. I suggest that we can look at what he did with the beggars of his day. The church's teaching was that if it was good to give alms, then you needed to have someone to give alms to, and nobody should change the structure of society. Luther broke from this, yes, that's what it was. Luther broke from this view by imagining a society without beggars, and then he went to work creating community chests that not only provided from the 15 or 20% who were beggars in that society, provided for them, but also provided for the elderly without means, or children without means, or any of the monks who decided to stay in the monasteries. Some of the proceeds to fund these community chests came from the proceeds of the closed monasteries. Some came from the offerings that were in the church, because there always was a community chest offering, and others came from taxes. Luther not only saw the beggars, but he also came up with a plan to change the social structures and worked with others to bring this plan into operation. Something similar can be said about his proposal to the city councils that all young men and young women be provided schooling, because the effect of this was to expand what had previously been available only to the wealthy, to include everyone in the society. And it lowered one of the social barriers of his day and contributed to social justice. So I earlier identified three sources of polarization. I just talked now about the social structures. Let's come back to ideology. Ideology involves exalted claims for the authority and truth of an idea or a proposal. A Marxist ideology blames everything on capitalism. A capitalist ideology believes a free market economy will solve every problem. And for any ideology, its claims to authority and truth almost often lead its adherents to try to achieve it by force. Because it's crucial, if this is the only way, that everybody get on board with it, and if persuasion doesn't work, then coercion proceeds. We can think of Luther's day. The Anabaptists were mistreated by all of the Protestant and Catholics of the day who thought they had the right view of church and society. And so what happened to the Anabaptists was they were drowned or burned at the stake or hung up in a cage simply to die as people of the city went to and fro on the streets below. And so when we encounter ISIS, so convinced of its ideology that it's ready to persecute fellow Muslims, as at least some people would call them fellow Muslims, or anybody else that gets in the way. There are lots of precedents for this. And whether it's in the 16th century or it's in the 21st century, ideologies do not like dissent, because dissent is understood to be opposition. When we consider Luther's response to ideology, we need to start with his theology. Luther objected to the scholastics, as many of you know, who tried to create a coherent, unified, and complete set of Christian teachings, and when there wasn't an answer in Revelation or the scriptures, they inferred an answer from what was revealed in order to fill in the spaces, and then over time the distinction between what had been inferred and what had been revealed was lost, and forgotten, and too much was claimed for the whole. Instead of trying to fill in the blanks, Luther thought, Theology should simply admit its incompleteness. It should stick with what had been revealed and live with unanswered questions. Because even in Revelation, God remained hidden, and even in the Scriptures, there were questions in the Psalms and the Gospels for which there were no answers provided. Because God remains hidden, we cannot even in Christ see the fullness of God, and we cannot see the world through God's eyes, and therefore the knowledge of the world as well as the knowledge of God is always incomplete and always distorted by our finitude and our sinfulness. This makes any claim to an ideology untenable. No matter whether that ideology is political, or ethical, or scientific, or religious, or theological, or social, it's all untenable because of Luther's understanding of what we can know and what we cannot know. The implication is that we've always got something to learn, and it might just be the person who disagrees with us who's ready to teach us. I think it's possible to understand, and here I'm not going to explain it, but just hope that as you think about it, you'll see what I'm saying. I think it's possible to understand Luther's insistence on free grace, which means we don't have to have a particular way of thinking, his emphasis on human freedom, meaning there's no one way to act, his use of reason, and his objections to the theology of glory to move beyond ideology and focus on the common good. His insistence on all of these theological principles was a way to make room for a more deliberative procedure in matters of the community. Here he prized wisdom and practical reason. He trusted deliberation. He favored the kind of justice that's not possible when ideologies are being enforced. And the whole purpose of education was to equip people to do this kind of thinking, and this kind of discussion, and this kind of deliberating. So that they could be leaders of their community. Making room for wisdom, practical reason, and deliberation undercut the unholy alliance of religion and ideology, of partisan politics and ideology. Now we know this was not its effect on the years following Luther's death. His ideas were sometimes treated as a new ideology. And when religious war broke out, ideology came back into being, because one always needs an ideology to fight a war. Maybe it's time now to retrieve the possibility that Luther's thinking opened up. The possibility that grace frees us from all ideologies and frees us to chip away at the barriers that ideologies create. Instead of ideology, Luther wants us to focus on the relational. Yes, ideas are important, learning is important, but they're important insofar as they heal and reconcile. They're important insofar as they free and equip people to serve the neighbor and the community, insofar as they provide guidance as to how we are to do these things. Ideologies provide a false sense of security and safety. It takes grace coming through another person, ultimately from God, but through another person, to free us to risk a fresh look at the world. Having considered two of the reasons for polarization, let's come to the third: anxiety and fear. Fear of terrorism is threatening to drive a wedge between Americans who are Muslim and those who are not. It's threatening to exclude the refugees who desperately need a place to go, despite all of the scriptural encouragement to look out for the sojourner and the wayfarer, the refugees of that day. And despite the fact that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were themselves refugees. A newspaper article this last week pointed out that the reason given by people who own guns for owning them has changed since the 1990s, when it was primarily in order to hunt or to do target practice. They now say their guns are for protection from other people. One of the lead authors on the study that produced this result said, "When I look at our survey, what I see is a population living in fear." What's the antidote? Luther's answer is a down-to-earth God who is working behind the scenes to establish shalom. Notice his frequent insistence that we are not to take vengeance. Even when injustice were on the side of the peasants, they were not to take vengeance, because vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. What underlines these reminders is his confidence that God is at work and that God will level the playing field. And thus he quotes again and again the passage from Luke 1 where Mary says, praises God for lifting up the lowly, breaking down the powerful, feeding the hungry, and sending the rich away empty. If God is at work creating justice and peace, then there's little to fear. Unless, of course, we're benefiting from injustice and conflict. Two things need to happen here. One is that the church in our time and in society should be a matchmaker for the community. That is, it should be the place which fosters personal connections between immigrants and other residents, between Muslims and Christians, between police and minorities, between any groups that fear each other, so that personal ties can overcome isolation and fear. A whole series of sociological studies have taught us that people today tend to interact only with those in the same social class or working in the same occupation. If polarization is to end, we need to help our society overcome this kind of social isolation. And again, I say the solution isn't always complicated. Parker Palmer wrote a book recently about democracy, and he tells about talking with a pastor whose congregation was noted for making a contribution to the community in which it was located. And he said to the pastor, "What's the secret of your success?" The pastor said, "Potluck suppers." And after Parker Palmer had been taken aback, he said, "Can you explain that?" And the pastor said, "Well, potluck suppers in our church are not a place for members to schmooze. Potluck suppers are a place where we bring people together to converse over the dinner table. So if there's a problem in the schools, we bring teachers and parents together to have their conversation, so that when the issue gets to the school board, there's some level of trust and understanding that's been occurred. At least people know each other when it's under consideration. Or if there's a problem in the community, we bring the police and the people from the community together. And so when the issue gets to the city council, they've already had a chance to talk about it." The second thing that besides being a matchmaker of the community, it needs to happen is the church needs to be the agent of providing accurate information. It's amazing to me how much misinformation exaggerates people's fears. For example, immigrants simply do not take jobs away from Americans people who have been raised in America. They work at entirely different jobs. For example, instead of winding up unemployed, many immigrants start new businesses, which means that in the communities where there are larger numbers of immigrants, the economic vitality of those communities is higher than those in which there are fewer immigrants. For example, lowering taxes does not automatically stimulate the economy or produce new employment. For example, the chances of being in a terrorist attack are much, much less than being killed in an automobile. In fact, all of the people killed by terrorists since 9/11/2001 is less than what's been killed by gun violence in the last 3 months. For example, the arguments between political parties is not about how large the government should be. It's simply false. The entire argument is about what the government should be doing. Should it be spending its money on social programs? Should it be spending its money on the military? Should it be spending its money on reducing taxes or whatever you fill in? It's all about what the government should or should not do. For example, the restrictions on women in Saudi Arabia are simply because of the Wahhabi sect of Muslim that's there and not typical of Islam in general. So there are in fact more women in universities in Iran than there are men, contrary to the image. For example, Arabs are not the major players in Muslim. Of the 5 countries with the largest number of Muslims, none of them are Arab. And you put all the Arab countries together and they would rank 10th on the list of where you'd find the most Muslims. And yet most people identify Arab and Islam as if they fit together. Not only do we need more accurate and more complete information on the topic, but we also need to help each other understand how important accurate information is. Because bad ideas sooner or later wind up hurting somebody. In order for polarization to be overcome, we need to foster in the church what James Hunter calls pre-political conversations. That is, conversations that are not oriented toward finding support for a particular proposal, but exploring a problem and trying to find common ground where our moral considerations overlap and we find enough understanding to be able to work together on finding a solution for it. And when the topic is controversial, we need some rules for how we engage in those conversations. One of them is you need to have good information. My guess is that 99% of the people that engage in arguments about Roe versus Wade have never read it. It's very interesting. Sit down and read it sometime. But James Hunter offers 4 rules. Number 1, those who claim a right to dissent should assume the responsibility to debate. That is, in other words, people need to be ready to explain and give reasons for what they say. Second, those who claim the right to criticize should assume the responsibility to comprehend, which means committed to listening to the other person who disagrees with you well enough to say what they think in ways they'll say, yes, you got it. Third, those who claim the right to influence should accept the responsibility not to inflame. Ideas are to be proposed for reasons, with reasonable reasons, and they should not primarily appeal to emotions. Fourth, those who claim the right to participate should accept the responsibility to persuade. An opinion shouted loudly is not enough. One needs to show how the proposal affects the common good. How will this benefit the whole community? Will it foster justice? Will it benefit the marginalized? Who will benefit and who will not? Or consider Michael Kinnaman. He's a theologian in the Disciples of Christ tradition, now working out in Seattle. And he told a group that I was a part one time that in the days when sexuality was being really a hot topic, he went around to the Disciples of Christ in various cities around the nation and just held discussions. And he said he had everybody agree in the room before they started to talk that they needed, if they were going to speak, they needed to point out how whatever they said advanced the gospel. And if somebody stood up and could not say that, he'd say, pardon me, please sit down. I'm going to give the floor to somebody else. And because it had been agreed upon by the people who came into the room, he had their support in doing that. To my conclusion, our task has been to assess the legacy of the Reformation. My argument is that he had some things to say that are of direct value to our engagement in the larger community today. His society was different from ours, yes, but we can still gain something. To bring this together, I want to underline what the churches can do. I attended a class in my home congregation last Sunday when Brian Kunkel, one of the chaplains from Gustavus, told about a significant transition in his life when he heard Sister Jean Pregin who is the nun in Dead Man Walking, say on his campus, our theological affirmations have public implications. Our theological affirmations have public implications. So what are the theological affirmations of the Lutheran tradition that are important for overcoming polarization? Let me simply suggest a list. Number one, every person is created in the image of God and has intrinsic value. Number two, as creatures, we are all connected. What harms one harms us all. What benefits one benefits us all. Third, we have a vocation, a calling to serve the neighbor and the community, and this calling applies not just to us as individuals, but to the church. A fourth is that God is hidden as well as revealed, and that we must recognize the gap between our theology and God. Our theology is tentative, incomplete, and in service to the relational. And ideology is neither tentative, nor incomplete, nor in service to the relational. A fifth is that God is at work behind the scenes, fostering shalom, creating justice, making all things new. This is the source of our hope and the basis of our engagement. A sixth is that God's generosity and mercy overflow, and that this generosity gives us freedom, including the freedom to cross boundaries and to act out of love rather than fear. Seventh, we need to grow in wisdom and practical reason in order to know how to serve their communities effectively, in order to avoid letting good intentions inadvertently produce harmful results. To come at this from the other side, if our theology emphasizes God and me, we will not overcome polarization. If our theology is an ideology or endorses an ideology, we will not overcome polarization. If our theology does not combat misinformation, or does not help overcome the anxiety and fear that isolate, we will not overcome polarization. And if polarization is not overcome, then sooner or later our citizens will welcome a demagogue who promises unity and promises to get things done. Our calling and the calling of our churches is to serve the community by fostering shalom. How do we do this? I submit that the first crucial step is reconciliation, the kind that actively overcomes isolation and polarization. If our churches don't do this, then who? And if not now, then when? Thank you.